Though often called the country's melting pot, New York City is probably better considered its pressure cooker. Covering barely 302 square miles across 5 boroughs, this unrelenting metropolis has seen more than 1 million residents leave since 2020 alone. Yet, somehow, the population barely moves. So what's going on here? Is it the thrill of the skyline? The gravitational pull of Broadway lights? Some kind of collective delusion? Or is it something harder to name? Something about density, chaos, and reinvention that simply doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet? Stay tuned to find those answers as we talk about why so many people stay in New York City. New York's name traces back to the Duke of York. The name has stuck around for 350 years, and today it belongs to a city that, despite its outsized reputation, is almost absurdly small in physical terms. New York City covers just 302.6 square miles of land. To put that into perspective, you could fit the entire 5 boroughs inside Alaska's Wrangell St. Elias National Park more than 43 times over, with room to spare. And yet, within that small footprint live more than 8.3 million people, making it the single most populous city in the United States by a wide margin, more than double the population of Los Angeles, the country's second largest city. New York is about as saturated with humanity as anywhere on Earth gets. The city's overall population density sits at roughly 29,000 people per square mile, but that number hides just how extreme things get at the center. Manhattan alone crams in over 70,000 people per square mile, making it denser than Mumbai, denser than Manila, and denser than nearly every other urban core on the planet. If the rest of the United States were packed as tightly as Manhattan, the entire nation's population could theoretically fit within the state of Rhode Island. So, what's actually inside all that density if there's so little room to spare? First of all, the subway. New York operates the largest rapid transit system in the world by number of stations, with 472 stations spread across the boroughs, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It never stops, not for snowstorms, not for holidays, not even during blackouts, when battery-powered emergency lighting keeps trains crawling toward the nearest platform. Below and around this transit system lie 8 million stories layered on top of each other. Pre-war walk-ups, glass towers, tenement buildings still standing from the 1800s, and construction sites perpetually reshaping the skyline. New York issues more building permits in a single year than most entire states process in 5. New York is also a city defined by water, wrapped almost entirely by it. The 5 boroughs sit across 520 miles of shoreline, more coastline than Miami, Boston, and San Diego combined. Of Manhattan's 22.7 square miles, you're never more than a 15-minute walk from a river. 21 bridges and 13 tunnels stitch the boroughs together. And yet, on any given morning, over 4,000 taxis, 13,000 Ubers, and countless cyclists and pedestrians clog the same handful of crossings, all trying to reach the same 23-square-mile island at the same time. It's a logistical nightmare that, somehow, mostly works. And that's just the movement of people. As for green space, it just so happens that New York City contains over 30,000 acres of parkland spread across 1,700 individual parks and playgrounds. Central Park alone draws in around 42 million visitors a year, more annual visitors than the entire country of Australia. Prospect Park, the High Line, Fort Tryon Park, each one a green pocket carved into a city that could have easily paved over every inch of open space and didn't. As a place defined by density more than open sprawl, New York's public infrastructure is stretched about as thin as any in the country. The subway alone carries more than 3.6 million riders on an average weekday, more than the entire populations of Chicago and Philadelphia combined, boarding trains every single day. And surprisingly, the busiest single transit hub in the Western Hemisphere, Grand Central Terminal, is right here in New York, moving roughly 750,000 people through its halls daily. With such extraordinary overcrowding, and the towers and tunnels making up New York's built environment, it is characterized by what can only be called relentless sensory and financial pressure. In terms of cost, New York ranks among the most expensive cities not just in America, but on Earth. The median rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan now exceeds $4,200 a month. It's one of the many barriers New York poses to comfortable or even modestly stable living. You could be forgiven for thinking, well, that's just Manhattan. Surely the rest of the city is more forgiving. But unfortunately, in New York, affordability obeys other laws than what most Americans come to expect as normal. The pressure of high costs touches nearly every borough. An impressive 44% of New Yorkers are considered rent-burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing alone. Some pay well over half. And that, as we'll see later, is where a lot of the mystery about why anyone stays truly begins. It makes some sense, then, that New York has one of the highest rates of small living spaces in the country, given such financial pressure. The average Manhattan apartment measures around 700 square feet, smaller than a lot of American two-car garages. And while suburban homes in the rest of the country have been steadily growing larger for decades, in New York, the opposite trend holds. Apartments are shrinking, and micro units under 400 square feet are becoming increasingly common, with some renting for well over $2,000 a month. Furniture here has had to evolve accordingly. Murphy beds that fold into walls, ottomans that double as storage, kitchens barely wide enough for one person to open the fridge and the oven at the same time. An entire micro-apartment industry has sprung up just to help people fit an entire life into a space that, in most of the rest of the country, wouldn't even qualify as a starter home. New York isn't just defined by its density or its architecture. What truly sets it apart is its intensity. Despite the crowding, the noise, and the cost, New York feels almost impossibly alive, buzzing with an energy that doesn't let up day or night. This city, one of the smallest in physical footprint among major American metros, is also one of the loudest, both literally and culturally. Average ambient street noise in parts of Manhattan regularly exceeds 80 decibels, comparable to standing next to a running garbage disposal all day, every day. Sirens, jackhammers, honking cabs, the rattle of a subway grate underfoot, someone's music leaking out of a passing car window. It layers into a kind of constant, low roar that most New Yorkers stop consciously hearing after a while, the same way people who live near train tracks eventually sleep straight through the whistle. Visitors, by contrast, often can't sleep their first few nights in the city at all, kept awake by a soundscape that native residents have long since tuned out entirely. The population density of New York doesn't just mean crowded sidewalks. It means a level of daily friction that few other American cities can match. By comparison, the average population density across the rest of the country sits at around 94 people per square mile. New York's overall density is over 300 times higher than that national average. Statistically speaking, this makes New York one of the most physically demanding places for a human to simply exist in, let alone thrive. While the density figure gives us an average of how packed the city is, the day-to-day reality is even more intense. Rats alone are estimated to number somewhere between 2 and 3 million across the 5 boroughs, roughly 1 rat for every 3 New Yorkers. Add to that the noise, the crowding on trains during rush hour, when subway cars can pack in over 200 people into a space designed for a fraction of that number, and daily life in New York starts to look less like convenience and more like an endurance sport. If it's starting to seem like an exhausting place, this is just the surface. What makes New York even more demanding is how expensive nearly everything is beyond just rent. A single subway ride costs $2.90. A modest lunch can easily run $20, and parking a car, if you're brave enough to own one, can cost more per month than an entire mortgage payment in most of the country. In fact, only a small fraction of New York City households, around 22%, even own a car at all, a rate lower than almost anywhere else in America. and the roads themselves are remarkably clogged. New York drivers lose an average of well over 100 hours a year sitting in traffic, more time lost to gridlock than nearly any other American city. Congestion pricing, introduced in Manhattan to reduce this exact problem, charges drivers a toll simply to enter the city's own core business district. By comparison, most American cities have never needed to charge people just to drive downtown. This means that New York, despite being the country's economic and cultural capital, is also one of the most physically punishing places to simply get around. And this isn't exactly a flaw waiting to be fixed. In fact, the density, historic street grid, and sheer volume of people in New York pose transportation and infrastructure problems that simply don't exist at lower densities. As a New Yorker's saying goes, there are only two seasons in the city: construction and the 2 weeks in October when the weather is perfect. Stay tuned. You'll find out why people still choose this over almost anywhere else in just a moment. New Yorkers are forced to use subways, buses, ferries, and their own 2 feet for the vast majority of daily transportation. Even though delays and overcrowding often make this a frustrating task, it means that a lot of daily life is spent navigating around infrastructure built well over a century ago, patched and repatched to keep up with modern demand. In fact, some of the original subway tunnels beneath the city date back to 1904, still carrying millions of riders each day on infrastructure older than most countries' entire rail systems. Beyond the sheer physical intensity of daily New York life, another facet of what makes it demanding is just how expensive it is relative to nearly everywhere else humans choose to live in America. While plenty of cities have high costs of living, New York's combination of small living spaces, high transit costs, and eye-watering rent puts it in a category mostly shared with cities like London, Tokyo, and Hong Kong, none of which are exactly known for spacious, easy living either. The scarcity of affordable, comfortable living in New York today is especially remarkable when you consider how deep the city's roots run in American history. Historians estimate the Lenape people lived across the region that would become New York for thousands of years before European contact, fishing its rivers and cultivating its woodlands long before a single skyscraper existed. Their trails, in fact, still shape the city today. Broadway itself is widely believed to trace the route of an old Lenape footpath, which is part of why it cuts diagonally across Manhattan's otherwise rigid street grid instead of running in a straight line like every avenue around it. Dutch settlers arrived in the early 1600s, establishing New Amsterdam as a trading post at the southern tip of Manhattan, a settlement so small and so focused on commerce that it had no real government of its own for the first several years. Just a fort, a handful of warehouses, and a wall built along what is now Wall Street to keep out both livestock and invaders. It's also believed that from nearly the very beginning, the settlement's growth was driven not by comfort, but by the promise of something else entirely: trade, exchange, and the constant churn of new arrivals hoping to remake themselves. Even under Dutch rule, the population was startlingly mixed for its time. A 1643 account from a visiting missionary claimed that as many as 18 different languages were already being spoken on the streets of a town that, at the time, held barely 500 people. In other words, New York was already behaving like New York centuries before it ever earned the name. So why do so many people put up with New York's relentless pace and cost today? And also, why have people, for over 350 years now, kept choosing it as a place to build a life in the first place? As you'll soon find out, it may not be such a mystery that New York remains so magnetic, since the grit, adaptability, and sheer stubbornness required to survive there long term are the surest test of who actually belongs. Let's start with how New York first grew from a small trading outpost into the most populous city in the country. For a long time, the settlement remained modest. By 1700, New Amsterdam turned New York held only around 5,000 residents, a population smaller than a single large apartment complex in the city today. But the city's position at the mouth of the Hudson River connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the interior of the continent, made it an unusually strategic spot for trade and migration, and growth accelerated quickly from there. By 1790, at the time of the first U.S. Census, New York City's population had grown to just over 33,000 people. Coincidentally, almost exactly the same population Alaska wouldn't reach until nearly a century later. Within just 60 years, by 1850, that number had exploded past 500,000, making New York the largest city in the country by a wide margin. The difference between Alaska's population growth and New York's growth over the same era says a great deal about what draws humans to a place. It isn't simply resources or space, but density itself, the presence of other people, and everything that density makes possible. Between 1892 and 1954, over 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island alone, many of them settling permanently in New York's neighborhoods. Entire sections of the city became linguistic and cultural islands unto themselves. Little Italy, Chinatown, Yorkville's German enclave, the Lower East Side's dense Jewish tenements, each one a full transplanted world compressed into a few square blocks. By 1900, New York's population had reached 3.4 million, more than the population of most entire U.S. states at the time. One of the countless immigrants drawn to New York during this era was a young tailor's apprentice who arrived from Eastern Europe in the early 1900s with barely a few coins to his name, unable to speak a word of English. He found lodging in a shared tenement room with 11 other men, working 16-hour days in a garment factory for wages that barely covered rent and food. The building itself, like thousands of others crowded onto the Lower East Side at the time, had no running water above the ground floor, no real ventilation, and a single outhouse shared by every family on the block. Conditions so cramped that public health officials of the era measured some tenement blocks at over 700 people per acre, a density that would still be considered extreme by today's standards. Like so many others who arrived in that period, he had no plan beyond survival, no promise of comfortable housing, no guarantee of steady income, nothing waiting for him except the chance to start over in a place dense enough, chaotic enough, and anonymous enough that nobody asked where he came from or what he'd left behind. Within a decade, he had learned English from his neighbors, saved enough to open a small shopfront of his own, and married a woman from a different immigrant community entirely, a kind of union that would have been unthinkable back home, but was ordinary on a New York block where a dozen cultures lived stacked on top of each other. What made this possible wasn't charity or comfort, it was proximity. A stairwell shared with 6 other families, a stoop where every neighbor spoke a different mother tongue, a factory floor where survival depended on cooperating with people you'd never have met anywhere else. All of it forced a kind of fast, involuntary community that no amount of planning could have engineered on purpose. His story wasn't unique. It was, in fact, the story repeated in some form across nearly every tenement building, every factory floor, and every crowded street corner of turn-of-the-century New York. People arriving with almost nothing and finding a city's sheer density of strangers created a kind of freedom that smaller, more homogeneous towns back home simply couldn't offer. New York asks a high price from those who choose to make it their home, even for a little while. Higher still for those who expect comfort or space. The reward isn't wealth or ease. It's something else entirely, and it's what keeps millions of people paying that price generation after generation. Let's explore just a few of the reasons that actually keep New Yorkers in New York, and why, despite the noise, the cost, and the crowding, so many people would never dream of leaving. First, there's anonymity and the strange freedom that comes with it. In a city of 8.3 million people, nobody is watching you closely enough to judge you. You can walk out your door dressed however you want, pursue whatever strange hobby or identity you're curious about, and blend into a crowd large enough that self-reinvention becomes almost routine. Ride the subway at any hour, and you'll pass someone in a full sequined gown next to someone in scrubs next to someone practicing a stand-up set under their breath, and not one person on that train will look up twice. Because in New York, being noticed usually requires a lot more than just being different. Compare that to a small town of a few thousand people, where everyone knows your business before you've even decided what it is. Isn't it strange that a city built to hold more people per square foot than almost anywhere else on Earth is also, for many, the place they feel the most free to simply be themselves? Then there's the sheer density of experience. Within a single subway ride, you can pass through neighborhoods representing dozens of different countries, cuisines, and languages, more cultural range in 20 minutes underground than most Americans encounter in a year. Take the 7 train out through Queens on a Sunday afternoon, and you'll pass through a stretch of track where the signage outside the windows shifts from Spanish to Korean to Nepali to Greek in the space of 6 stops, each one its own self-contained world with its own bakeries, its own grocers, its own rhythm of daily life. New York is home to over 800 languages spoken across its 5 boroughs, making it linguistically the most diverse city on the planet, more diverse than London, more diverse than Los Angeles, more diverse than any other urban center anywhere. Is there anywhere else in the country where you could eat Sichuan food for lunch, Senegalese food for dinner, and pass a dozen other cuisines just walking between the two? Food itself plays an outsized role in why people stay. New York has more than 23,000 restaurants, one for every 360 residents, an astonishing ratio compared to most American cities. Because rents are so punishing and competition so fierce, restaurants here are forced to specialize, to innovate, to fight for every single customer, which paradoxically produces some of the most inventive food culture anywhere in the country. A restaurant that can't earn its keep in a neighborhood this crowded, with this many alternatives within a 2-block radius, simply doesn't survive long enough to get comfortable, which means the ones that do survive tend to be genuinely worth the trip. Would a city of cheap rent and little competition ever produce that same relentless drive toward culinary excellence? There's also the matter of scale and access. Within New York's 5 boroughs sits some of the largest cultural institutions on Earth. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, holding over 1.5 million individual works. The New York City Public Library System, with over 50 million items in its collection. And Broadway, which sold over 14 million tickets in a single recent season alone. Add to that hundreds of smaller institutions most tourists never even hear about. The Tenement Museum, the Cloisters, dozens of experimental theaters tucked into basements and converted warehouses across Brooklyn and the Lower East Side. And the sheer volume of accessible culture becomes almost impossible to exhaust in a single lifetime, let alone a single visit. Nowhere else in America can someone with an ordinary income step outside their apartment and, within a 20-minute subway ride, stand in front of a Rembrandt, catch a Tony-winning play, or watch a world-class orchestra, all without needing their own car, plan a trip, or take a day off work to do it. And then there's the transit system itself. Flawed, delayed, and occasionally infuriating, but also one of the only public transportation networks in the country that lets someone live an entire adult life without ever needing to drive. No car payment, no insurance premium, no monthly parking bill that rivals rent in most other American cities. Just a $2.90 swipe that can take you from a Sunday morning in a Brooklyn park to a Tuesday night show in Midtown to a 2 a.m. diner run in the East Village, all without ever touching a steering wheel. Compare that to most of the country, where losing access to a car effectively means losing access to work, groceries, and everyone you know. Isn't it telling that in a country largely built around the automobile, one of its most desirable cities to live in is precisely the one place where you don't need a car at all? But there's something to be said for New York's relationship with time itself. Because the subway runs all night, because delis and diners stay open around the clock, because the city genuinely never fully closes, New Yorkers develop a relationship with their own schedules that doesn't exist almost anywhere else in America. Need groceries at 3 a.m.? a bagel at 5, a conversation with a stranger at a bar at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, all of that is just an elevator ride away. There's a particular kind of comfort in knowing that no matter how badly a night is going, or how badly you need a slice of pizza at an hour when the rest of the country is fast asleep, the city is still awake and ready for you. Isn't there something oddly comforting about living in a place that simply never stops functioning, no matter what hour you need it? Then, there's the strange, specific way New Yorkers look out for each other, despite the city's reputation for coldness. Someone faints on a crowded subway platform, and within seconds, 3 strangers are kneeling beside them, one already calling for help, another fanning them with a folded newspaper, all without a word exchanged beforehand about who was supposed to do what. Someone's stroller gets stuck at the top of a subway staircase, and a stranger has usually grabbed the other end before they've even had time to ask. It's a city famous for minding its own business, and yet, somehow, also a city where a crisis on the sidewalk draws help almost instantly, precisely because there are simply so many people around to notice. Is that coldness? Or is it just a different, faster kind of community? One built less on knowing your neighbor's name and more on trusting that in a crowd this size, someone is always close enough to help. Community, too, plays a far bigger role than most outsiders assume. Because apartments are small, New Yorkers live more of their lives outside them, in parks, in coffee shops, on stoops, in hallway conversations that happen when you're squeezed together in a building with dozens of neighbors sharing the same thin walls. A building with 50 units can easily hold more people than an entire suburban cul-de-sac. And unlike a cul-de-sac, everyone in it shares an elevator, a mailroom, a laundry room, and a stairwell during every single fire drill. Small living spaces, paradoxically, tend to produce larger social lives. Doesn't it seem backwards that a city known for cramped apartments might actually be one of the least isolating places to live in the entire country? And finally, there's the sheer momentum of the place. The sense that history is still being written here, block by block, the same way it always has been. From Dutch traders to Ellis Island immigrants to today's arrivals from every corner of the globe, New York has always been a city defined not by comfort, but by movement, by people willing to trade space, quiet, and affordability for something harder to quantify, the feeling of being at the center of something enormous and alive. Walk past any random New York apartment building on any random evening, and you're standing beside dozens of lives running in parallel, someone rehearsing lines for an audition, someone closing a late-night business call, someone cooking a recipe passed down from a grandmother 3 countries away, someone just back from a double shift, all stacked on top of each other, all part of the same relentless churn that's been running since the 1600s and, by every indication, has no plans to stop. So, is it the skyline? Not really. Most longtime New Yorkers barely look up anymore, and plenty of the tallest towers sit half empty as investment properties rather than homes. Is it Broadway? Only partly. The theaters and museums matter, but most New Yorkers see a handful of shows a year at most, not enough on its own to explain why 8.3 million people tolerate the 700-square-foot apartment and a rat problem. Is it some kind of collective delusion, then? Everyone just too stubborn or too broke to admit the city has beaten them? For some, maybe, for a while. But a delusion doesn't survive 350 years, 4 centuries of immigration waves, and a population that keeps refilling itself the moment anyone leaves. What actually explains it is the harder-to-name thing mentioned at the start, the anonymity, the density of culture packed into a single subway ride, the food scene sharpened by brutal competition, the freedom to invent yourself among strangers, and a city that never fully turns its lights off. That's not delusion. That's just what density, chaos, and reinvention add up to when you stack 8 million people on top of each other and let them figure it out. As we've seen, New York is a city of paradoxes. At once, one of the most punishing places to live in the country and one of the most magnetic. It's a place where some find their true identity, their community, and a sense of belonging they couldn't find anywhere else. And where others, worn down by the noise and the cost, eventually pack up and leave for good. So, though New York will likely never become an easy or spacious place to call home, it will always hold a certain pull over the people who live there, and the millions more who dream of moving in. It will continue to draw those of us tempted by density, diversity, and reinvention out into its crowded streets and packed subway cars to see if we have what it takes to stay. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. It really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on Coordinate X.